Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. On Monday, despite widespread international opposition, the Knesset voted overwhelmingly to approve two bills, essentially banning UNRWA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees and their descendants, from operating in Israel, curtailing the group's activities in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The world obviously broke out in an uproar, condemning Israel for undermining Palestinian rights, their ability to rebuild after the war, and anything else they could come up with. Any talk about how UNRWA perpetuates the conflict, eternalizes a refugee crisis from 8 decades ago, or even how a small number, or actually not a small number, of their workers are active terrorists in Gaza and Lebanon, and even some participated in the October 7th massacre, well, that you won't hear anything about. The situation cannot be more upside down. But here's the reality. October 7 was a shock to the Israeli system, and the war since, on both fronts of Gaza and Lebanon, is about changing that paradigm and providing security for decades to come, not just for years. Stopping to work for UNRWA is part of that, because UNRWA is not the solution, it is the problem, and Israel is finally doing something about it. There's no one better to talk to about this issue than Einat Wilf. Einat is a former member of Knesset and the author with Adi Schwartz of War of Return, a book that argues that UNRWA and the Western Palestinian belief in a so-called right of return is one of the largest obstacles to successful diplomacy and lasting peace in the region. This is an important topic. You'll want to have a listen.
Einat, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you back on the show. We're talking, obviously, after the Israeli Knesset passed bills that are meant to bar UNRWA from being able to operate inside Israel and potentially also have an impact on UNRWA from being able to operate in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, because they would obviously have to coordinate with Israel. Now that might be something that is problematic for them. So I'm curious, first of all, just, give us a bit of what these laws actually mean and what your take is on them.
Okay, so first of all, it's important to note that both laws were passed by a massive majority in the Knesset. That in itself is almost unheard of, that the Knesset operates in such cooperation and such support on an issue that is at the heart of Israeli interests and on something that the world doesn't want and that also the government would have enjoyed not having the headache. So first of all, in itself, it's a huge achievement that actually speaks to the fact that this enjoys broad support among the citizens of Israel. So anyone that tries to portray it, or it's the evil right-wing government, this is actually by the Knesset and by the support of almost all the citizens of Israel and their representatives.
And if I'm not mistaken, it was like 92 members of Knesset against 10 or something like that.
Exactly. Right. And in something that is at the core of Israeli, kind of the Israeli interests, that is unheard of.
Right.
Okay. So the two laws that were passed, one is a smaller one. It's a law that basically says that Israel cannot, that UNRWA cannot operate in Israeli sovereign territory. So that would be the immediate challenge to the law, that it's actually not, that East Jerusalem is not sovereign Israeli territory, and therefore the Knesset law doesn't pass there. That's one law, I would say the less important one. The more important one is the one that basically says that Israel is ending its voluntary cooperation with UNRWA, and that it is actually criminalizing any Israeli who seeks to work with UNRWA or who cooperates with it. Why is this actually more important and more significant? Until 1967, UNRWA operates in areas that are not within Israeli control: West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. After 1967, the West Bank and Gaza are under Israeli control. It's a 6-day war, lots of territory, many ad hoc decisions. Israel basically says, okay, there's this organization operating in the West Bank and Gaza. They provide some services, we'll cooperate with them. And there's an exchange of letters that basically says, we will voluntarily cooperate with you, and each side can end this cooperation in a week's notice. What this law basically says is, we're ending the cooperation. This is totally within Israel's right to do. Israel is not obligated to cooperate with UNRWA. UNRWA will try to claim that it does, but it's not. This is a voluntary cooperation. The other thing is basically the law says Israelis cannot cooperate with UNRWA. And here there's a more substantial impact because UNRWA enjoys a variety of privileges and rights that come from the fact that Israel wanted to make it easier for it to operate in the West Bank and Gaza. Again, Israel doesn't have to, but for many years, it made what I think is the mistaken idea that it should cooperate with UNRWA, and UNRWA is somehow a positive force or a stabilizing force. So the impact of this will be that the Palestinians, and it's important to say, UNRWA, despite the continued allure of the letters UN, is basically a purely Palestinian organization. The people who are what are called UNRWA employees are all Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. They are the teachers, they are the administrators. And to say that Israel can no longer cooperate with UNRWA, it means that you're essentially removing the facade and the layer of UNRWA between Israel and those Palestinians. So the Palestinian who wakes up tomorrow in Ramallah and wants to go teach at an UNRWA school, which is what they did yesterday, they will still do that. But if they expect to have like some special visa from Israel or some special dispensation or anything of the sort, because they're UNRWA, that will no longer be possible. They will have to appeal maybe through the Palestinian Authority, but like a regular Palestinian.
In other words, they even like getting equipment or facilitating transportation, whatever, will be something that Israel will not be able to accommodate anymore based on these laws.
Not as UNRWA, but
Right.
as Palestinians, as people through the Palestinian Authority, but it no longer becomes something special.
Now, I mean, there's a lot of problems with UNRWA, right? And I want you to kind of, if you can, lay them out for us because, I think people, they know that there was this thing that was created that was meant to, relief work agency, meant to give to the Palestinian people as opposed to regular refugees, which had their own high commissioner. There's been the implication or incrimination of Palestinians from Gaza, UNRWA workers who were involved in the October 7th massacre, as well as people who since then have been identified as UNRWA workers also in Lebanon and in Gaza, working on behalf of terrorist organizations. We know that too. But like, outline for us really, there's some of that I look at as kind of like tactical problems. Like, okay, UNRWA worker being a bad guy, fine. Doesn't mean the whole thing is rotten, but there is a rotten piece to UNRWA, right? Which is just its existence. So give us kind of, why is UNRWA bad?
Okay, so we'll do it actually through the October 7th prism. The first is the wrong question to ask is how many direct UNRWA employees, and again, remember, they're Gazans, they're not Norwegians or Swedes. How many direct UNRWA employees, so Gazans who were directly paid by Western money, how many of them participated in the October 7th massacre? That's the wrong question to ask. The question is, how many of the butchers of October 7th, both the trained murderers of Hamas and the so-called ordinary Gazans who participated in the massacre, how many of them were registered by UNRWA as refugees, despite not being refugees by any international standard? They were born and living in Gaza all their lives. How many of them were educated in UNRWA schools, learning day after day that they need to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea? How many of them lived in neighborhoods that are mistakenly named refugee camps, but no one there is a refugee and they're not camps? If you had asked those questions, the answer would have been everybody, or maybe nearly everybody. Maybe you can find one or two exceptions. So that helps you understand that UNRWA is essentially the fertile soil, the ideological background from which violent Palestinian organizations repeatedly spring. So it used to be called Fatah or Black September. The perpetrators of the massacre of the Munich Olympics were all graduates of the UNRWA schools and camps. So the fact that violence, terrorism emerges from UNRWA is not a bug, it's a feature, because it constantly legitimizes and educates and raises generation after generation of Palestinians to believe that it is their noble duty to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. That's one thing that UNRWA does. The other thing, to look at it from the perspective of October 7th, is that UNRWA essentially relieves Palestinians to butcher Jews. And I'll explain. A few months after October 7th, one Hamas operative, a Hamas leader, Abu Marzouk, in response to the question, why are the people of Gaza not allowed to use the tunnels for their protection against Israeli air raids? He said, what? The tunnels are for us, essentially for the Hamas operatives. The people of Gaza are the UN's responsibility. And when they say UN, they mean UNRWA. So basically what he's saying is, look, there's a division of labor here. We focus on butchering Jews. For that, we've built the tunnels, we've weaponized the entire landscape of Gaza so that we
can do that because UNRWA is going to take care of the people.
Exactly. And we are relieved of our governing responsibility, and money is fungible. So we can take money to focus on that because the West pays for what normally we would have to pay. And those are essentially the twin functions of UNRWA. The fertile soil of Palestinian terrorism and relieving Palestinians to engage in terrorism.
But it's also, I mean, the fertile soil, but like if I phrase it maybe a little differently, it's the perpetuation of the conflict, essentially, right? It's because by like you said, you know, everybody's a refugee in a fake refugee camp with fake refugee status. It's keeping that narrative going when, you know, I mean, we could all consider ourselves refugees, right? My grandparents were refugees from Poland, right? I could say I am a refugee no matter where I live in the world, but I'm not. I mean, like, we don't carry that narrative.
Exactly. Because as you correctly said, throughout the 20th century, there are numerous wars and empires collapse and new nations and states are established and borders are established and tens of millions of people flee across these newly created borders. They are expelled, typically to the side that is more ethnically and nationally and religiously similar to them. And they all got the memo. And the memo was this: it's tough, it's tragic, and you move on. And the idea was that this is how you establish peace. People move on. Like you said, they do not consider themselves refugees after 70, 80, 90, 100 years, and they move on to build prosperous lives where they are. The only exception to that are the Arab refugees from Israel's War of Independence, a reminder, an entirely unnecessary war that the Arabs only waged because it was more important for them that the Jews not have a state rather than they have a state of their own. Refugees were created in that war. Nothing unique about that. What is unique is the Arab refugees hijacked the temporary agency that was supposed to settle them to ensure that it would not settle a single refugee and constantly perpetuate their status contrary to any international standards, in the view that they did not lose the war. So essentially, UNRWA sits at the base of the original sin that allowed the Arab refugees to avoid coming to terms with the fact that they lost the war against an establishment of a Jewish state and that they need to move on. They hijacked UNRWA in order to say, we're not moving on. We will only move on when there's no Jewish state. And in the service of ensuring that there's no Jewish state, we will perpetuate ourselves as refugees. We will believe in a non-existent idea called a right of return, and we will constantly issue forth terrorist groups to make the Jewish state, the lives of its people, living hell until it no longer exists.
And I think also just has to be said, you know, it's the weaponization of the Palestinians, right? It's to constantly have this weapon at your disposal to discharge at Israel anytime you want to be able to push some sort of narrative that's, you know, going to say, well, Israel's doing this and Israel's doing that, and there's still the right of return. I mean, everything you're saying here, it's essentially creating a weapon that can be used as a tool against Israel.
A very willing weapon, but yes.
Yeah. So now here's what I don't get, because you've explained it very well and you've convinced me. But you know, the United States is warning of a catastrophe. France and the UK are going crazy, right? I mean, it's like the world has come to an end. Now, for people who I guess do have a bit of institutional memory, In 2018, Donald Trump, the president then of the United States, and we'll find out next week whether he's going to be returning or not, but the Trump administration cut the funding to UNRWA. We saw after October 7th, a number of countries suspended temporarily their funding to UNRWA. In other words, it's not new that UNRWA is a bad actor, right? What's new is that Israel is finally saying, in the framework of maybe the changes that we've long needed in the way we engage with the Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank or whatever it might be, we're changing and we're saying we're not playing this game anymore. But why is the world not understanding this?
So I'll take
the world. I'll say our people are supposed to be our friends in the world.
Exactly. That has always been the difficult part. So it actually works together, because when I started on this journey about 20 years ago, by now I have a mountain of books and essays and lectures, and The War of Return, I must say, to its credit, is an incredibly well-researched book that even people who hate its recommendations, which is essentially defund UNRWA, have never challenged it on the facts. So when Adi and I began to go around the world and talk to all those nice countries, our friends, and to tell them, look at what you're funding, look, and we would tell them long before October 7th, we will pay for it in blood. This is not something nice here. We will pay in blood for what you're funding. And you know, everyone's like, no, it can't be. And the thing is this, over the years, I said that I can break apart any argument in favor of UNRWA, except one, the one where they say, what do you want from us? It's your government who's asking us to fund UNRWA. That was exactly the one argument I had nothing to say against, because it's true. For years, our government, our security systems were the Iron Dome of UNRWA, basically taking down any effort to defund it. Israel even actually tried to prevent Donald Trump from defunding UNRWA, Prime Minister Harper. We were the ones, because UNRWA is the forefather of the Qatari money. Our addiction to this lie of let's purchase quiet, let's pay protection to the mob, has an old history long before the cash money of Qatar, and it starts with UNRWA. We were addicted to a false sense of quiet. Clearly, October 7th has broken, for many Israelis, that addiction. And I am very proud of the Israeli Knesset. I'm very proud that opposition and coalition basically voted for a law saying we made a mistake, essentially, by agreeing to play ball with our executioners, and we're done. It's not that UNRWA goes away tomorrow, because, again, a lot of other countries continue to fund it, but at least you can no longer take cover with the fact that Israel supports it. So we're removing at least that excuse.
What could potentially, practically speaking for a moment, replace UNRWA, or is Israel saying, we don't really care at this point? I mean, do we need something else to be in place of UNRWA?
So here I often find my toughest kind of question, because people are like, what will replace UNRWA? By the way, the practical answer is very simple. In Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, it's the government. In the West Bank, it's the Palestinian Authority. But even in Gaza, it's the Palestinians themselves. It really shows how powerful the letters UN is, that people really say what will replace it, because they really think that it's Swedes and Norwegians who have come to Gaza to help the people rather than the Gazans themselves. So when people say what will replace UNRWA, I tell them, okay, once you really understand, and it takes a while to understand that, it took me years of research to really understand that, once you understand that UNRWA is not the firefighter, they're the arsonist. And the reason I know they're the arsonists is because way before October 7th, I went around and said, look, this organization is lighting fires. And now people are telling me, oh, but they're really necessary because we have a fire. And I'm like, but they're the ones that lit the fire. So once you understand that they're the arsonist, the question of what will replace them begins to emerge as very bizarre. Why would you want to replace the arsonist? They're the ones that cause you the trouble. Remove the arsonist and you will have far fewer fires. So the idea of what will replace UNRWA in the deepest sense of the word is, this is a radical idea, Palestinian responsibility, right? Because once you understand that UNRWA is a Palestinian organization, the teachers, the administrators, the people who are now, I don't know, distributing food, they're Palestinians, right? It's not Jürgen and Carolina, it's Ahmad and Fatma. Their ability to carry out their job doesn't matter if they have an UNRWA tag or not, whether they're considered a refugee or not. They can keep carrying out that job. Now, you might say, who will fund them? And here I have another radical idea, which is the Palestinians have the choice. It's the same choice they had for the last century to decide that they're going to end their stupid war against the existence of a Jewish state in any part of the land. They're going to decide to live next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. They're going to therefore live in peace and run an economy. They're going to collect taxes, and with those taxes, they're going to pay teachers and run their welfare services.
Crazy idea.
Crazy idea.
Well, I got to ask you, I mean, I want to, you kind of set me up to ask you the next question, which is, okay, if the Palestinians can do this, then let's start to talk about the day after. But before I get to the day after, because I want to pick your brain on that. I mean, you wrote this book together with Adi Schwartz about 4 or 5 years ago now. Then UNRWA, there were like people on the inside who were talking about this. It was very much like the inside baseball kind of, yeah, they're bad. We should have something else. But, no one was really, I mean, it's really come out in the last year, I think, definitely even before October 7th, definitely, I think the book contributed to a discourse and a conversation on this. But really in the last year, it's blown up in a new way. So I'm just curious, like, I know just on a personal level for a second, if I may, it must be good. Is a good feeling, no?
I'll tell you this, we've been approached by our publisher who works with you guys, as you know, to write an updated version of The War of Return. And when I told Adi, there's a proposition to write an updated version, he was like, what am I going to say? We told you so? And I was like, well, in so many words. But really, especially seeing visually the Knesset vote, I think it was 92 green voting for, opposition and coalition, essentially reflecting the deepest Israeli consensus that we're not going to cooperate with an organization that constantly undermines the idea that the Jews should have one state that they could call their own. It is indeed satisfying. And now that there is at least some consensus in Israel, we now need to get our friends to finally understand what a terrible organization it is.
Yeah. Well, good luck. I mean, I think I think there's a lot of books, by the way, that need to be updated, and this is definitely one of them. I'd personally been thinking about it for one of my books about Israel's weapons technology, which also needs something of an update. We're talking also with the same publisher about that. But okay, I do want to go back for one moment. You mentioned, okay, so the Palestinians could replace it. They could actually function as a society. They could function and collect taxes and everything. Let's try to get into a moment into where is Israel going with this? Because obviously we need a deal that would get back the hostages and would allow for a ceasefire. I don't see another way that Israel agrees to stop fighting. But you do need somebody to manage the daily life of the Palestinians in Gaza. And assuming it's not us, and we don't want Hamas to continue to do that, that's the purpose of the war. What do you see happening, Einat?
So my vision is to actually stop talking about who and to talk about what. Meaning, don't talk about this organization, this person, this thing. Say what? Say, we need the Palestinians to become a people who want to live next to the Jewish state rather than from the river to the sea. Until they are those people, it is war between us. I mean, I don't think that Israel is under any responsibility to care for its enemy. I sometimes think that we have internalized so much abuse that our imagination has become limited and our standards low. We immediately assume that the enemy, who still is our enemy, right? They refuse to surrender. We need to take care of our enemy while they are still fighting us. So I say, absolutely not. I don't see why we need to be any different than any other country that fought wars, which said, okay, as long as your vision is from the river to the sea, certainly as long as you hold hostages, we are under no responsibility for you. You are a people at war with us. When you end your war, we will happily trade with you, live with you in peace side by side. But until then, why are we responsible for you? It's not our responsibility. We didn't massacre ourselves, even though some people are trying to promote that notion now. You did that. You invaded, you massacred. You are responsible until you end this war. And the war is not the Gaza war. The war is the 100-year war against Zionism. And until then, we're not responsible. So for me, the day after is the day after Palestinians end their war against Zionism. And until then, we're not responsible.
Okay, but I'll accept that. It's a nice idea, but practically speaking, we want stability on the ground in Gaza because that's also our security interest. So we need somebody who's going to take care of it.
Okay, so I want to disagree with the notion that taking care of them before they have ended their century-long war against Zionism is a source of stability. This is precisely what Adi and I were constantly telling military leaders, people high up at the IDF. We were telling them, you are not buying quiet. The fact that Palestinians are in schools run by UNRWA is not giving you stability. It's actually building up the next war. So
without de-radicalization is what you're saying. What are we achieving, really?
Before de-radicalization, the war has to be over. And the war means that Palestinians have to accept that given that in the last century, they have attempted to achieve one goal and one goal only, that the Jews would not have a state anywhere between the river and the sea, they have lost. Now, I've brought that message many places. I remember especially when I brought it in Oslo a few years ago to Norwegian's member of parliament. I think they were apoplectic. They almost collapsed because, we live in this era of everybody gets a trophy. Heaven forbid people actually have to accept that they lost. But one of my favorite books since October 7th is called Embracing Defeat. And it's about Japan after World War II. And it actually beautifully makes the case that by knowing they were defeated, by surrendering and embracing that and drawing a line, they were able to move on and become the prosperous, peaceful nation that they are today. So I actually think it would be the kindest thing for the Palestinians if people stopped saying, oh, how do we bring in money and who should run them? Basically tell them, look, guys, we have only one expectation from you. We actually saw on October 7th, you're a highly capable people. You know how to do things. You've just kind of have terrible priorities. So we want to hear from you that your priority is no longer the destruction of the Jewish state, but it is the construction of your own. We are more than happy to help a constructive vision, but as long as your vision is destructive, you're on your own. And I want to argue that that is going to be far less destabilizing than if we rush to give them money before they have surrendered and accepted the deepest defeat.
Okay. Einat Wilf, thank you very much for really enlightening us about UNRWA and what is needed to really get this war over with in the victory that Israel so desperately has been trying to achieve. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in today's Jewish People's Podcast. Please join us every Monday and Thursday for new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere else where podcasts can be found. Have a great weekend and a Shabbat Shalom.